Welcome to video 34. In this video we are taking a look at simple delimited data and the CSV file format. So with that in mind, the purpose of this video is for you to understand the terms delimited data and the CSV file format, to be able to write a single line of delimited data to a text file or delimited text to a text file, which will then be in the CSV file format, and to read this into Python as a list, or of course we could also call that a one-dimensional array. In a similar vein, I will also be revisiting the concept of the one-dimensional array, which of course you need to know for your theory as well. You may want to revise one-dimensional arrays. In fact, if you're a little bit rusty, you will find them in video 17 in the Arrays, Records and Lists playlist. As usual guys, just a quick reminder that the Python Monster resources on Schoology are there to help you if you wish to use them. You of course have the videos, you have the Python Monster booklets and some other useful resources, including two catalogues, one of which divides the videos into a playlist view and the other one which lists the videos in sequence order with the data that you would find on the relevant video page on YouTube. Okay guys, so what is delimited text and the CSV file format? Well, just to put your mind at rest, there is actually very little brand new learning in this video. What I'm actually doing is I'm wrapping around Python programming and theory, which you've already come across in previous videos, but I'm introducing technical terms you may not be aware of to describe some of those concepts. So delimited text is data represented in a text file with the individual values separated by a consistent character, usually the comma or the semicolon. Now there are other possibilities, but the only thing you need to be concerned about, guys, or you're likely to use or come across, is either the comma or the semicolon. We call these special characters delimiters, strangely enough, and you would have seen this before, because when we ask a user to give us input separated by commas on one line, and we call that an input split, that of course is a classic example of delimited data, and it's separated by commas. CSV stands for the comma separated or comma separated values. Data in a CSV file or files are examples of delimited data. Okay, so CSV file may also contain semicolons as the character used as the delimiter. Now if that sounds a little bit strange because it's called a comma separated values file, it's simply because occasionally the comma is replaced by the semicolon as an alternative delimiter, and that's normally because of some issues around formatting where commas have already been used. All right, but we still call a file a CSV file regardless of whether the delimiter is a semicolon or a comma. Now you can save a spreadsheet, particularly of course an Excel spreadsheet, as a .csv file, and that's why the CSV file is well known, and it's a sort of common file format for delimited text or delimited data. So in essence, all a CSV file is just an example of delimited data. It's a text file with the values separated by either a comma or a semicolon. And in fact, if you wanted to prove the point, you could simply rename .csv at the end to .txt, and you can simply see that it's basically a text file with a special file format. Okay guys, so before we launch into a little bit more background and Python demos, quick question for you. Each list below contains data that was read from a different file. Which of these two lists do you think has captured data that was originally in a file containing delimited data? Or of course we could have called that a CSV file. Do you think that list 1 is an example of data that's been captured from a file containing delimited data, or do you think it's list number 2? Pause the video guys and have a think. The answer actually is the second list, because the first one just contains one single string and the commas are used as punctuation. And you can check that out, because if you check at either end of the string you will see an opening quote and a closing quote, which of course designates the one string as a string data type. The second string, okay, or the second list, and I've just reproduced it at the bottom of the screen there guys so you can see for yourself. All right, the second list contains 4 string values. Each of those strings has got its own pair of quotes. Okay, the punctuation has been removed, and I didn't have to do that. I just done that to make it easier to look at. Okay, each string value is accessed easily because each of those values occupies a specific index in the list. Okay, so hello at index 0, my name is Peter at index 1, etc., etc. The commas in this example, guys, are just used for the syntax. They're there to separate the string values. There are no commas being used here for punctuation. Also in this video, I will be using the terms lists and arrays interchangeably. Of course, there's a difference. If you're familiar with arrays, then you will know that Python lists are initialized differently to Python arrays, and we use different functions, of course, with Python lists. But I will be using the terms interchangeably. I will explain more in video 35 when we come to look at the relationship between delimited data and two-dimensional arrays, tables and matrices. Okay, so again, guys, have a look at video 17 or the other examples of videos on arrays if you're a little bit rusty. Okay, I think it is time for us to crack on and do some Python demos. So we're going to ask the user to input some values separated by commas. You've seen that done before. We're calling it delimited data, of course, now, or delimited input. The input, I think we will make pretend personal data. So let's have first name, last name, date of birth and phone number. So we'll make a start with that, but I have a feeling in both the output window and in the code, we're going to have a long string across the record window, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick print statement. I'm going to use the print function just to provide an introduction, and then I'm going to do a second input statement, and that will make sure that we don't go off the edge of the screen. Okay, so let's make a start with that. Let's put in here, let's put in a comment. So let's put in get user input. Shouldn't be really using the word get, guys. Actually, it's a bit naughty. That it's a bit slang. I should be using the term elicit. Right, but as you guys know from previous videos, I can't think, type and spell all at the same time, so get is a safer option for me. You guys actually should be using the proper term elicit user input really. So I've got an excuse, or at least I think I have. So get user input, and let's call it the variable, let's call it details, and let's say, no, let's not do that yet, let's do print, as I said I would. So print, let's say, please input the following data followed, sorry, not data followed, following data separated with commas and no spaces. Okay, and then I'm going to put details, because this is where we do an assignment. So details becomes, and then we want inputs. Okay, no casting because it's a string data type. Then we want our last prompt. So let's put in first name. Okay, last name, Dob, date of birth, and then let's say phone number. Okay, and then I want my usual 2 arrows. Okay, so that will do nicely. Now, thinking about it, I think it would be a good idea if we put a line of code in which actually did delete any spaces that the users put in, because actually it's very, very easy to forget and to naturally put in spaces between values for input. All right, so let's do that now. Let's say, in actual fact, guys, have a think about this. What Python function am I going to use to remove spaces in the user input? All right, so have a think about that whilst I pop in my comments. So I'm going to put in here remove spaces from original input. You may have answered the question strip, which would have been a very valid answer, but in fact strip won't work, because strip will only remove the trailing and the leading characters, and we're going to have spaces actually at different parts inside our string, so strip won't work. So what we're going to have to do is to use the function replace. All right, so I'm going to put in here details becomes, I'm going to use the old variable name and reassign it with a new value. So details then becomes, okay, and then I want details dot, and I want replace, guys. All right, so I want to specify the character I want to replace, which of course is a space, and to tell Python just to replace that character with nothing, in other words the equivalent of deleting it, we just put in a null value, which, guys, you know is 2 quotes back to back is the equivalent of a null value. So that should basically ask Python to do the equivalent of deleting that character whenever it finds it in the string. Okay, which is exactly what we want. So having done that, the next thing that we need to do In fact, let me just tidy this up a little bit. I'll just put that up there. Okay. The next thing we need to do is to actually get user input. Is to actually write it to a file. So the file format for that is, let's put in a comment first of all. Let's put write user input to the file. All right, we want, guys, with, okay, and then open. That's our standard format for working with files in Python. Then we're going to want brackets, and then we're going to want as my nickname, which I normally call my file. Okay, colon. So what goes in the brackets, guys? In the brackets, we're going to want the name of the file. So let's call it del example. Okay, so short for delimiter example. Okay, del example dot text. I've already got an old example of that, guys, from playing around with this before I actually did the video, so that's why it's there already, why it popped up. And of course, we're going to want the mode for working with the file, and the mode will be, guys, we want to actually write to the file, and then in the same block of code I want to read back the value. All right, so I want w plus to tell Python that I want to write and then read. Okay, so del example dot text and then comma w plus. That looks okay. Right, so within our indentation we want to write our single line of user input to the file. All right, why am I not using a Python split, guys, like you've seen before? Okay, why am I not doing that? Have a think whilst I put in my comment in. So write the single line of input to the file. Okay, well, because what we're doing, guys, is we're actually writing the raw input from the user straight to the text file, because we actually want the commas included. All right, we don't want to split out the commas. We actually want the commas to be included. We want to create a delimited file using commas, all right, so that we can use that format when we read the data back in again. All right, so there's no split at this point in the code. So this literally what we want to do is to do a write the line. Okay, so we want to say my file, and what's the format that we use, guys? All right, the simplest format, which is basically write. Okay, and then of course we need to tell Python what to write, so that will simply be details. Okay, and that is it in terms of writing to the file. Now what we want to do is to read back the text from the file, which is delimited text, guys, as we know, because we've just created that. So read back the text from the file as delimited data. All right, now we have a problem reading this back without putting in an extra magic line of code. Can you remember what that is, guys, from the classroom or from a previous video? And what's the problem associated with this? The problem is that if we've written to a file and then we try and read it straight back again, the Python pointer, which is used to point to the most recent line of text in the file, is still at the end of the file. So if we try and read stuff back in, there aren't any more lines to read back in. Python doesn't generate an error, it just tells us there are no files to read, no lines to read, so we don't get anything. So we need to reposition the pointer back to the beginning of the file, and the way that we do that is we say my file dot and then seek, okay, and then put in index of 0, takes it right back to the very beginning of the file. All right, so that's the first thing that we need to do. So I will say reposition pointer to start a file. There we go. And then of course, guys, we just need a single read statement. Okay, so it will be details, okay, and then dot read line. All right, that's our standard suggested syntax, guys. All right, for reading in not details, guys, sorry, my file dot read line. Okay, my file dot read line, and then open and close brackets, and that we want to assign to a value. So we will say, let's call it details again. Okay, so details equals my file dot read line, so that's read the single line from the file into the variable details. Okay, now this time of course we do need to split, because what we've got is a single string with commas in, and the commas don't have any significance until we use them. So we're going to use the commas to split our string into individual values. Okay, and we're going to use Python split function to do that. So let's give it a different variable name. Let's say my list, because we're going to end up with a list for this. So my list becomes, okay, and then we want details dot split. Okay, and then we need to tell Python the delimiter that we've used, which is of course the comma in this case, guys. Okay, so let's just move that up. Okay, and I'm just going to put a comment in here, okay, to say split into values within a list. Okay, all right, so now we're making use of the comments which were originally written into the file. So what would be useful, I think, is if we finished with our file handling, guys. Okay, so I can put a little comment here. In fact, we had really finished at this point here. So let's pop in a comment that says end of file handling. All right, just to make it clear where we have finished with that single block of code. This then can go over to the margin because that doesn't need to be indented anymore. All right, so I think what would be useful now that we've done all of our mechanics is to actually print out, I think, the original value we read in from the file, and then the value that's resulted from us using the commas and using the Python split function. So let's put in here print original file text. Okay, so that basically is, guys, just print details, isn't it? Because that's what we had when we read it straight in from the file. And then let's put in here, let's put in a new line. This time I just put in a print rather than a \n. Let's put in here print the list version of the data. Okay, and we want to print my list on this occasion, guys. Okay, there we go. So hopefully that should work okay. So let's run it and see what we get. Okay, so we have, let's just move this over, guys, and I'll just zoom in just a little bit. Okay, in fact, let's move it over a little bit more. First name, last name, job and phone number. So let's put in Peter, comma. I'm just going to deliberately put in some spaces just to see if our remove function works. Okay, so let's do Peter and then Smith, okay, comma, date of birth 22nd 02 1981. Okay, and then let's put in an imaginary phone number. Let's put in 05. There we go. Okay, so here, guys, is our original text that we read in from the file as was. Okay, so this is delimited data. All we've got in there is the individual values that we asked the user for. Okay, separated by commas, but of course that's just one string there. And I'm pleased that the remove function has actually worked because those spaces have been taken out. Okay. Then when we read it in and we made use of the fact that this is delimited data and we asked Python to identify where the commas were, we can then create a list with each of those values as individual string items at an individual index position within our list. Okay. So that basically, guys, is our first demo of how to write and work with, read back and work with delimited data. So let me just, before I move on, let me just move this back again, guys, so you can see the actual code again. Okay, and I will put a copy of this code in the Schoology folder to accompany the video as well. Okay, so let me just move out, and if you want to, guys, you can just then pause the video. All right, to have a look at the entire code solution, and I'm now going to move on to the next demo. So guys, for this second demo, I'm going to take the first demo and I'm going to extend it a little bit to cover off some stuff which I wanted to revisit, including the way in which we gain access to the individual values of a list, but also I just want to talk about one-dimensional arrays. So let's do each of those in turn. First question for you then, if I wanted to access the individual values inside a Python list, what two common options are available to me? What have we covered in Classroom and in the videos? Well, the answer to that question is, number one, we can unpack the list. All right, and that's quite a good option here because we have values which are sort of related but very individual, and we've only got 4 of them. So unpacking specific variables with their own particular context, or unpacking specific values, I should say, with their own particular context, is a good example of where we could use unpacking. The other option is simply to iterate through the list, and we've got a number, we've even got a number of options for iterating as well. So let's do unpack first. All right, so let's just zoom in. And quite simply, guys, I'm going to put a comment here which says unpack the list. So let's do unpack the list. How do I do that then, guys? How do I unpack a Python list? Well, the first thing that I want to do is to create enough variables, okay, for me to assign each of the different values that I've got within my list. We've got 4 of them, so I'm going to need four variables. Okay, so let's say we have a variable called first name. Nice sensible names, first name and then last name. Okay, and let's say DOB for date of birth. Okay, and sorry guys, not sure what happened to that. DOB for date of birth, and then let's say TEL for telephone number. Good old-fashioned acronym for telephone number. Okay, they will become the values of that are inside the list. All right, so I will put equals, and then I just want my list. Okay, now once you've got those, of course, you could do string manipulation with each of the values assigned to those variables. You could do casting if you wanted to do some maths with the date of birth, for example, once you've done a little bit of isolating of values in there. Whatever you want to do. For the purpose of this demo though, I'm just going to print out the values assigned to these variables so that you can see that it has actually worked. So all I want to do, guys, is some simple print statements. Okay, using the print function, we want first name. Okay, and let's print, oops. Okay, let's print out last name, obviously. Okay, we want to print out for date of birth, so we want to print DOB, and lastly but not leastly, we want to print out TEL. Okay, so let's run that then, and let's put in some different values this time around, because I think Peter gets picked on quite a lot. All right, so let's just zoom in a little bit. Let's put Janet, comma Brown. Okay, let's give her a date of birth of 12th of the 3rd and 1975. I just put 03 in there just to keep it consistent with what I've done before. Let's move this over so you can see an imaginary telephone number. So let's put in 065. Okay, so guys, we have the outputs from the code that we originally wrote from the first demo. Okay, but we also have, of course, here the results of our extra lines of code to print out the values assigned to the variables, okay, that resulted from unpacking our list. Okay, so we have Janet Brown, her date of birth and her telephone number. So unpacking has worked quite well. The other option, guys, is to use the very simple iteration that Python provides for looping through a collection. So let's do that then. So let's get rid of these boxes and let's move this over. Okay, so at the end here, guys, I'm just going to put in a new line print. Let me just scroll down a little bit. Okay, so let's just put print a new line. Okay, I could have put a \n somewhere in here. Okay, but I'll just do this very quickly. And here I'm going to put iterate through the list. All right, and we want a variable name. The syntax is for variable name. Let's say p details for personal details in. Okay, and then we want the name of our list, my list. Okay, and then quite simply on the next line we want to print each of the values of p details. Okay, so we want to print p details. All right, so let's run that. We should get the same result, shouldn't we, if they've worked correctly. So let's stick with Janet. I can't quite remember all of the details, guys, but I'll try and keep it just a little bit consistent. So let's put in Janet. Well, let's give Janet a capital name at least. Janet Brown. Okay, date of birth 12th, I think, was it the 3rd, 1975, I think, followed by an imaginary telephone number. So let me just move that over a bit more for you. Okay, so guys, we have the same outputs produced, different constructs, different syntax, different approach, same outputs. Okay, so there's from using unpack, and there quite simply is iteration. Of course, the big difference between the two is in iteration we didn't assign any values to variables. Okay, we just printed out on the screen. All right, so it would have been tricky to have assigned each of those values to different variables. So unpack works quite well if you want to assign data that you can use later on in your program, of course. Iteration, we just use that as an example of showing you the value of p details, which was the variable that we used in our iteration. Right, guys, so having done that, I just want to reintroduce the idea of one-dimensional arrays. Okay, guys, so as you know, very briefly, because I've covered all of this in previous videos, we don't have the array data structure, the traditional array data structure in Python. Python does not have arrays. What it does have is the Python list, and we can do a pretty good job of simulating how arrays work using a Python list, because they're very similar. The big difference is the way that we initialize them, but in this particular demo and this example of working with files, we're not initializing an empty array. All right, so if you had an example like this or an extract from this in an exam and you ask questions about reading in delimited data from a file, it is perfectly acceptable for you guys to say that you're reading the data into a one-dimensional array. So up until now we've been talking about a list. All right, switch the terminology. You can quite acceptably say that you are reading the data in from a file into a one-dimensional array. It only works with a one-dimensional array because we've only got one string that we're reading in. Okay, if we had more than that, then we wouldn't be able to use a one-dimensional array. One string being read in from the file, we can say that we are assigning it to a one-dimensional array. So the question then is, if we are talking about one-dimensional arrays here and the traditional array data structure, what option do we have to iterate through an array? Well, we can't really use the Python collections iteration because it's not a Python list, and we can't really use for in either because all of that stuff is for Python. What we can do, however, is to use a traditional for loop, which is available in all of the other languages that do use arrays, and we can simulate iterating through a traditional array in that way. So let's put in here using a for loop to iterate through a 1D array. Okay, so how do we do that then, guys? Well, we want to use for in and range because that's the syntax for a for loop in Python. So let's do for, and then let's say count in range. Okay, and then what I could do, of course, is simply len of my list. Okay, which will do nicely. So let's put a colon on the end, and then we simply want to print out the value of my list at that particular index in the array. Okay, which is count. All right, so let's see if that works for us. Okay, so let's run. Let's put in, let's stick with Janet again. Okay. So let's move that over because I'm going to run out of room for phone number, aren't I? So Janet Brown. Okay, 12th of March, I think it was 1975, and then a made up phone number. Okay, and there we go, guys. All right, so did I put in a lowercase for after all that? Never mind, sorry, Janet. Right, guys, so here you can see that using the concept of the array, all right, so talking about what we've done in terms of a one-dimensional array, all right, we have looped or iterated through our traditional one-dimensional array using a for loop, and we have made use of the fact that a one-dimensional array has index values which are sequential to loop through and access the value at each of those indexes in turn to print out our contents. Okay, so of course we get the same as we did when we iterated through a Python list. The point that I wanted to make, guys, is it's perfectly acceptable to switch terminology, talk about bringing the values in from a file and reading them into a one-dimensional array, and then using a traditional for loop to iterate through your one-dimensional array. Okay, guys, so that is the end of the demo. It's also the end of this video. In the next video, we're going to be talking much more about what we've seen here, but we're going to be talking about spreadsheets with numerous rows of data that have been saved as a CSV file, and then using a two-dimensional array to be able to store and work with that data in tabular or table form. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.